The year was 1879, and the first wind of the season came scouring across the plains like a dry-mouthed beast. It hit the small, sun-bleached settlement of Gopher Creek with a purpose, kicking up the fine red dust that coated everything: the tired wooden storefronts, the sagging porch rails, the very soul of the place, the sign for the general store. Hanging from one rusty hinge, creaked a lonesome rhythmic complaint against the gusts. It was a sound that settled deep in the bones, a constant reminder that here, in this vast and unforgiving land, everything was slowly, inevitably, wearing down. Through this swirling haze of grit and noise, a lone rider approached. He sat atop a gray stallion whose coat was the color of a gathering storm cloud, a stark contrast to the red earth it kicked up with each steady hoofbeat. The man was Silas Boone, and the set of his shoulders spoke of a familiarity with solitude. His duster was faded to a shade of brown that was almost indistinguishable from the dust itself, weathered by sun and rain into a second skin. A low-brimmed hat, stained with sweat and time, was pulled down tight, its shadow cutting a sharp, mysterious line across the upper half of his face, leaving only a firm jaw and a mouth set in a permanent line of grim patience visible to the world. He rode with an economy of motion, a stillness in the saddle that suggested he was as much a part of the landscape as the unyielding mesquite and the distant, flat-topped mesas. The wooden planks of the Gopher Creek Bridge groaned under the weight of his horse. Mercury, the sound a low bass note in the wind's high-pitched song. His eyes, shielded beneath the brim of his hat, caught a flicker of stalled motion just past the bridge, where the main street of the town properly began. A wagon, sturdily built and covered with a clean canvas top that marked it as something other than a farmer's cart or a prospector's rig, was stopped dead. It sat at an awkward angle, one of its rear wheels straining against a thick rope that had somehow become tangled in the brake mechanism, pulling it taut and locking the axle. A woman stood with her back to him, her shoulders tensed with effort. She wore a simple, practical dress of dark blue cotton, and her hair, the color of rich honey, was bundled in a tight knot at the nape of her neck, though stray strands had escaped to whip across her face in the relentless wind. She was pulling at the rope, her body braced against the wagon, but the knot was unforgiving. Silas reined Mercury to a halt. He watched for a moment, his expression unreadable. Men were spilling out of the saloon, their laughter coarse and loud, but none made a move to help. They leaned against the hitching posts, rolling cigarettes, watching the woman struggle with a kind of lazy, detached amusement. It was her problem, not theirs. In Gopher Creek, a person's troubles were their own property, with a sigh so quiet it was stolen by the wind. Silas swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted. The jingle of his spurs was a small, sharp sound against the backdrop of the wind and the creaking sign. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his boots making soft thuds in the thick dust. He walked not to his horse's head, but to its side, and with a familiar motion. He took off his hat and carefully placed it on the worn leather of his saddle. It was a gesture of strange significance, like a knight removing his helm. The shadow was gone, and his face was now fully exposed to the harsh light. It was a lean face, weathered and browned by the sun, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, clear, and guarded. There were lines etched at their corners, lines that spoke more of squinting into the sun than of laughter. He approached the wagon without a word. The woman, Eliza Hart, didn't hear him coming over the whine of the wind. She was still focused on the tangled rope, her knuckles white with strain. She was muttering to herself, a stream of frustrated words lost to the elements. Silas stopped just behind her. He could smell the faint scent of soap and something clean and medicinal, a stark contrast to the town's prevailing odors of dust, horses, and cheap whiskey. He didn't speak. He simply reached out a gloved hand and laid it on the rope. The leather of his glove was worn smooth in places, rough in others. The rope was wound tight, the fibers swollen and stiff with grit, cinched into a knot that seemed to have a malicious intelligence of its own. It felt to him like a constricted throat, Eliza started at the sudden presence, the unexpected touch. She turned her head, her eyes a startling shade of green, like new leaves after a rain widening in surprise. She saw the lean, weathered face, the pale, serious eyes, and the large, capable hand resting on the source of her frustration. For a heartbeat, she was wary. A lone woman on the road learned wariness before she learned anything else. But there was nothing threatening in his posture, only a quiet readiness. Her shoulders slumped in a wave of exhausted relief. She let go of the rope, her breath coming out in a rush. She looked from his face to the tangled brake, her mind clearly working on the mechanics of the problem, not the man who had appeared to solve it. The axle was old, the wood strained. If the tension was released too quickly, it could snap, leaving her stranded for good. She leaned in closer, her voice low and urgent, meant only for him against the howl of the wind. "Undo me? Slowly," she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning she never intended. She was talking about the wagon, about the precarious balance of tension and release required to free the wheel without breaking the axle. She meant the ropes, the knot, the machine. Silas heard the practical instruction. His mind registered the mechanical problem, the danger to the axle, the need for a careful hand. But the words themselves, spoken in that soft, urgent whisper, landed somewhere deeper. They bypassed the calloused shell he had built around himself and struck a place that hadn't been touched in years. He felt a strange, unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with the rope in his hand. He didn't let it show. His expression remained a mask of stoic neutrality. He simply gave a short, sharp nod to show he understood. He took a firm grip on the rope. His hands, even through the gloves, were powerful and sure. He didn't yank or pull, but applied a steady, patient pressure, testing the tension. He leaned his weight into it, his boots digging into the dust for purchase. He could feel the strain in his back and shoulders, the resistance of the knot. He began to work at it, his fingers surprisingly nimble as he traced the path of the rope, seeking the key to its puzzle. He worked with a focus that blocked out the rest of the world, the wind, the town, the watching eyes from the saloon. There was only him, the woman standing a few feet away, and the stubborn knot. From the shaded doorway of the saloon, Barrett Mercer watched the scene with narrowed eyes. Mercer was a man who looked out of place in Gopher Creek. His suit was dark and well-tailored, his boots polished, and his face was clean-shaven, revealing a mouth that was perpetually turned down at the corners, as if soured by the world's inefficiencies. He was an agent for the railroad, a harbinger of progress and steel rails. And he looked at the dusty landscape not with affection but with an appraiser's cold calculation. He saw Silas Boone not as a man, but as an obstacle, a stubborn rancher with acres of stubborn land that stood directly in the path of the future. Seeing him now, engaged in this small act of chivalry, a smirk touched Mercer's lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of contempt. It was the look of a man who understood power and saw any action not bent toward its acquisition as a fool's errand. Silas worked on, oblivious. He found the point of maximum tension and began to patiently manipulate the fibers, coaxing a bit of slack into the tangle. One loop loosened, then another. His calloused fingers moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, easing the pressure bit by bit. He could feel the slight vibration as the tension began to bleed out of the system. Eliza stood by, watching his hands, her own held tightly in front of her, her breath held in her chest. The wagon groaned, a low, wooden sigh. As the brake began to ease, he unwound the last loop, and with a final, soft thump, the rope fell free. The wagon shifted, settling back onto its springs with a soft creak. It was free. Silas straightened up, coiling the freed rope and hanging it from a hook on the side of the wagon where it belonged. He didn't look at her. He looked at the wheel, at the brake, checking to make sure nothing had been damaged. "Thank you," Eliza said, her voice clear and sincere now that the wind had momentarily died down. "I thought I was going to be there until the next frost. He just grunted in response, his gaze still fixed on the wagon. He flexed his hand and only then noticed the angry red scrape across his wrist where the rope had snapped against his skin, tearing through the cuff of his glove. Eliza saw it too. "You're hurt." Before he could protest or wave it away, she moved to the back of the wagon, unlatched a small wooden chest, and retrieved a roll of clean linen and a small tin of salve. She was a nurse. This was her instinct. "Here, let me see." She reached for his arm. Silas flinched, pulling back instinctively, a reflexive motion born of years of keeping people at a distance. Her hand stopped in midair. Her green eyes met his pale blue ones, and she saw a flicker of something there, not anger, but a deep, ingrained wariness, a profound discomfort with being touched, with being tended to. She didn't push. She simply held out a torn strip of the white linen. "You should wrap it," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "This dust, it gets in everything. It'll fester." He stared at the piece of cloth for a long moment. Then at her face. He seemed to be having an internal debate. Finally, with a sigh that was almost imperceptible, he took the bandage from her. His fingers brushed hers for the briefest of moments, a fleeting contact of calloused skin against soft. He quickly turned his back to her and awkwardly, using his other hand and his teeth, began to wrap the bandage around his scraped wrist. His movements were clumsy, unfamiliar with the act of self-care. Just then, from the small wooden church at the end of the street, a bell began to toll. It was a clear, resonant sound that cut through the air, signaling the end of the workday, or perhaps just the end of another day. The wind seemed to heed its call, finally beginning to settle. The red dust began to drift back to the earth, the air clearing in the soft, golden light of the late afternoon. Silas finished with his wrist and turned back toward his horse. His business concluded. He had solved the problem. That was enough. "Wait," Eliza called after him. "At least let me know your name. I'm Eliza Hart." He stopped but didn't turn around. His shoulders were a rigid line. "Boone," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Silas Boone." He didn't offer any more. He didn't need to. The name Boone was known here. It carried its own weight, its own history of tragedy and stubborn solitude. He swung himself up onto Mercury's back with a fluid, practiced motion. He settled into the saddle, took his hat, and placed it back on his head, bringing the shadow down over his face once more. He gathered the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, he urged the stallion forward, riding down the main street and out of town without a backward glance. Eliza watched him go, a tall, lonely figure dissolving into the vast, open country. Her eyes, thoughtful and curious, followed the fading silhouette of the man who had appeared like a ghost from the dust and disappeared just as quietly. Silas rode on, the rhythm of his horse a familiar comfort. He didn't look back, but he could feel her gaze on him, a strange and unsettling warmth between his shoulder blades. He rode toward his ranch, a place of silence and empty spaces, a place he had curated to keep the world at bay. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he couldn't shake the feeling of the encounter. He felt the phantom pressure of the rope in his hands, heard the echo of a softly spoken whisper in the wind, in the quiet, guarded depths of his own heart. Silas Boone felt the slightest, most terrifying shift, as if the first loop of a knot he'd been tied in for years had just begun, ever so slowly, to loosen. The town of Gopher Creek was a memory before the dust from its bridge had fully settled on Eliza Hart's wagon. Her true destination lay another day's ride north, a slightly larger, slightly more permanent settlement huddled in a shallow valley, Barlow Flats. Here, the wind had less of a run at things, and the buildings stood a little straighter. She found what she was looking for in a disused stable at the edge of town, owned by a blacksmith who was happy to have a few coins for a space that otherwise held only cobwebs and the ghosts of long-gone horses. Eliza swept the packed earth floor herself, her movements brisk and efficient. She aired the place out, the scent of old hay and leather giving way to the sharper, cleaner smells of carbolic soap and alcohol from her medical chests. With a hammer and a few nails, she secured a wooden plank over the entrance, a hand-painted sign swinging from 2 loops of twine. The lettering was neat and clear, Dr. E. Hart, care for injuries, ailments, and beneath, in smaller script. A phrase that caused more than a few townsfolk to stop and read it twice, payment as you are able. She set up a cot in a corner, a small table for her instruments, and with that, her practice was open. She was a quiet fixture of purpose in a town that was mostly accustomed to aimless drifting, miles away. In the dim light of his own kitchen, Silas Boone did not drift. He was anchored to a heavy wooden table, a ledger open before him. The scratch of his pencil was the only sound, a dry, rasping noise that seemed to fill the silence of the empty ranch house. He tallied figures, his lips moving silently with the calculations. The columns were stark and unforgiving: the cost of feed, the price of salt licks, the bill for a new water pump. On the other side of the ledger was the projected income from his herd, a number that seemed to shrink with each pass of the pencil, and looming over all of it, circled in a definitive, menacing ring, was a date. The day his loan was due at the Barlow Flats Bank, a bank that had recently and quietly been acquired by Barrett Mercer's railroad interests. The pencil lead snapped under the pressure of his grip. A reputation, like a shadow, can fall long and dark before a person even arrives. Silas's was a permanent fixture in the region. It wasn't born of malice or ill deeds, but of tragedy, which in these parts was often treated as a communicable disease. The story of the fire, of the younger brother lost, had been told and retold, gaining new, grimmer details with each telling until it became a kind of local folklore. The result was a simple, unspoken creed among the people of Barlow Flats: trouble follows the Boones. It wasn't that they wished him ill, they simply wished him elsewhere. When they saw him in town, they would offer a curt nod, their eyes sliding away, their conversations halting until he had passed. They were not cruel people, merely superstitious and profoundly afraid of attracting a darkness they felt clung to him like burrs to a saddle blanket. His solitude was a wall built by his own grief, but the town had mortared it with their fear. Eliza, an outsider, was immune to this local mythology. She saw only what was in front of her. Her first patient was a young boy, no more than 7, whose mother carried him into the stable clinic with a face etched in panic. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. Eliza worked with a calm that was itself a kind of medicine. She bathed the boy's forehead with cool water, listened to his chest with her stethoscope, and administered a tincture of willow bark for the fever. She spoke to the mother in low, reassuring tones, explaining everything she was doing, demystifying the illness and chipping away at the terror. By evening, the boy's fever had broken, and he was sleeping peacefully on the cot. The mother, her face slick with tears of relief, pressed a handful of small coins into Eliza's palm. It couldn't have been more than $1, but with it came a whispered, "God bless you," that felt heavier and more valuable than any gold. This was why she was here. Not for the money, but for the weight of a thank you freely given. The next afternoon, Eliza went to the public well in the center of town to draw water. It was the social hub of Barlow Flats, a place of gossip and transaction. As she worked the hand pump, she saw a familiar figure approaching. Silas Boone rode into town, his face set in its usual impassive mask. He dismounted at the general store, his movements economical and detached, as he tied Mercury to the hitching post. Something small and dark slipped from his duster pocket and fell silently into the thick dust. He didn't notice. He went inside the store, the bell above the door announcing his unwelcome arrival. Eliza finished filling her buckets. She walked over to where the object had fallen and picked it up. It was a pocket knife. The wooden handle was worn smooth and dark with use, shaped perfectly to a man's palm. The blades were clean and sharpened to a fine edge. It was a simple, honest tool, a thing of purpose. She held it in her hand. the wood still holding a faint warmth. When Silas came out of the store, a sack of flour slung over his shoulder, he saw her standing by his horse, his body tensed, a barely perceptible stiffening of his shoulders. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes wary. "You dropped this," Eliza said, holding out the knife. He looked at the knife, then at her face. He seemed to search her expression for some hidden motive, some angle. Finding none, he walked forward and reached for it. As he took the knife, his fingers brushed against hers. It was the barest of contacts, a fleeting touch of calloused flesh against her skin. A jolt, small but distinct, passed between them. It was like the static spark that jumped from a wool blanket on a dry winter night, unexpected and startling. Both of them pulled their hands back at the same instant, as if burned. A sudden, awkward silence descended. Silas immediately turned his attention to the water trough, his gaze fixed on a floating leaf as if it were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. Eliza, equally flustered, found herself staring intently at the rhythmic splash of water pouring from the well pump into a bucket someone had left behind. The world seemed to narrow to these small, insignificant details, anything to avoid looking at each other. The air crackled with the unspoken acknowledgement of that brief, charged touch. The spell was broken by a third voice, one that was smooth, confident, and entirely unwelcome. "Boone, just the man I wanted to see." Barrett Mercer stepped out from the shade of the store's porch, a folder of papers tucked under his arm. He ignored Eliza completely, his focus entirely on Silas. "I was just reviewing the updated survey maps for the rail spur. It seems the most efficient route cuts directly across your northern pasture." Silas said nothing. He slid the pocket knife back into his duster, his expression unreadable. "I'm prepared to make you a fair offer," Mercer continued, his tone reasonable, persuasive. "Well above market value. It would clear your debt at the bank, leave you with a healthy sum besides. A clean handshake, and we both walk away satisfied." He extended a hand, a gesture of business-like finality. Silas looked at the offered hand, then up at Mercer's face. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was a silence more potent than any shouted refusal. It was a wall of pure, unyielding stubbornness. After a long moment, Silas turned, untied Mercury's reins, and swung himself into the saddle. He looked down at Mercer, and for the first time, a flicker of cold fire showed in his pale eyes. But he still didn't speak. He simply turned his horse and rode away. Mercer watched him go, the smile on his face tightening into a sneer. He let his hand drop to his side. Eliza, who had started to walk away, pretending to be occupied with her water buckets, paused. She was just out of sight, behind a stack of barrels, but she could hear Mercer speaking to the man who had accompanied him, a railroad foreman with a hard, flat face. Mercer's voice was low, but it carried on the still air, a sliver of ice. "Stubborn fool," he muttered. "He doesn't understand. That land is going to be ours one way or another." He paused, and his next words were laced with a chilling certainty. "If he doesn't sell, well, some properties just have a way of getting washed out in the seasonal flood." A shiver traced its way down Eliza's spine. It wasn't a threat of actual water. It was something else, something metaphorical and dangerous. She picked up her buckets and hurried back to the stable, the weight of the water feeling suddenly much heavier. That night, a cold north wind blew down from the mountains, rattling the loose boards of the old stable. Eliza lit her lamp, the small flame pushing back the encroaching darkness. She sat on her cot, a small leather-bound journal open on her lap. The events of the day replayed in her mind the sick child, the weight of the mother's gratitude, the spark of contact at the well, the cold menace in Mercer's voice. She thought of Silas Boone, a man encased in silence, a man tangled in something she didn't understand. She picked up her pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and in the flickering light, she wrote a knot, once pulled tight by grief or fear, does not untie itself. It requires pressure, patience. It requires a steady, gentle hand willing to work at the tangle, to trace the path of the rope back to its beginning, across the valley. Silas Boone sat on an upturned crate just outside his barn. He had built a small fire, the flames dancing and spitting against the immense, star-dusted darkness of the night sky. The same wind that rattled Eliza's clinic tugged at the collar of his duster. He wasn't writing, he wasn't a man for words. Instead, he held a piece of his horse's bridle in his hands, his thumb tracing the intricate pattern of a Turk's head knot tied into the leather rein. It was a complex, beautiful knot, one he had tied himself years ago. He stared into the flames, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing the knot, seeing the way each strand wrapped over and under the others, creating a pattern that was both strong and hopelessly entangled. He stared at it as if it held the answer to everything. The debt, the railroad, the ever-present shadow of the past. He sat there for a long time, the lone man and his small fire, a silent sentinel contemplating the knots of his own life, wondering if they could ever, possibly, be undone. When the wind shifted, turning to blow from the north with a damp, chilling edge that promised a change in the weather, the old scar on Silas Boone's left shoulder began to ache. It was a deep, puckered mark hidden beneath his shirt, a permanent reminder etched into his flesh. The pain wasn't sharp. It was a dull, persistent throb, a ghost of a burn that remembered the heat that had forged it. With the throb came the images, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. The night, 2 years gone, ripped open by a scream of orange against the black sky. The barn, not just a building but a lifetime of work, swallowed by flames that roared like a hungry god. The terrified bellows of trapped cattle, a sound that would forever live in the hollows of his memory. And Samuel, his younger brother, his face a pale oval of terror in the flickering hellscape, pinned beneath a fallen beam. Silas had been there, choking on smoke, his eyes streaming. He'd heaved at the beam, his muscles screaming in protest, but it wouldn't budge. It was held fast by a thick rope, part of the hoist system that had tangled and knotted in the fall. The knot was the key. He'd thrown himself at it, his fingers raw and clumsy, fumbling with the thick, hot fibers. "Undo me." Slowly. The words had not been spoken then, but the principle was the same. Panic was a tightening agent. He had to be calm, deliberate. He'd worked the knot, his mind a vortex of smoke and terror. Samuel's wheezing breaths counting down the seconds. He worked slowly, patiently, just as he knew he should. But the fire worked faster. The flames were a living thing, impatient and voracious. They licked at the rope, at his hands, at the very air he was trying to breathe. He'd loosened one loop, then another. He was almost there. The final twist. A groaning shudder from the rafters above. A shower of sparks. The world collapsing into a furnace of sound and heat. The memory always ended there, cutting off with the finality of a slammed door. He had gotten out. Samuel had not. The knot he couldn't untie in time was a sin that lay buried deep inside him, a hot coal of guilt that never truly cooled. This particular morning, the ache was insistent. He was in the corral, trying to ignore it, when he saw a wagon approaching on the long, dusty road that led to his ranch. It was Eliza Hart's medical wagon. A knot of a different kind tightened in his stomach. He wasn't a man who welcomed visitors. His ranch was his fortress, his solitude its primary defense. He watched as she pulled the wagon to a halt near the house, her movements as calm and deliberate as ever. She didn't call out to him, but simply sat for a moment, letting the dust settle as if giving him time to accept her presence. He saw that she was looking not at him, but at Mercury. His gray stallion was favoring his front right leg, his gait uneven as he shifted his weight. Silas had noticed the limp that morning but hadn't had the heart to deal with it yet. Dealing with it meant confronting another failure, another small thing he had let slide. Eliza climbed down from the wagon, carrying the small leather bag she always had with her. She walked to the corral fence, her green eyes clear and direct. "Morning, Mr. Boone. Your horse seems to be in some discomfort." He picked up a stone, Silas said. His voice clipped. It was an admission, and he hated making them. "May I have a look?" It was a question, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. He gave a short, reluctant nod and unlatched the corral gate. She stepped inside, moving slowly. Her hands held out where the horse could see them. She spoke to Mercury in a low, soothing murmur, and the stallion, usually skittish around strangers, seemed to relax under the calm authority of her voice. She ran a hand down his leg, and the horse allowed it. His ears pricked, but his body still. She lifted the hoof, cradling it expertly. She said softly. "It's more than a stone. It's packed in there with hard clay. You get this in the dry season, it's like concrete." Silas knew. He had a hoof pick for this very purpose. His usual method was to pry and chip away at it. A frustrating, forceful process. He watched as she examined the hoof, her brow furrowed in concentration. If you try to force it, you could bruise the frog. It's a delicate area. She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Don't just pull at it. You need to soften the mud first. Undo it a layer at a time." There it was again. That word, undo. He felt a strange resonance, a connection to the memory of the fire, to the knot that had defeated him. He stood there, frozen for a moment, the past and present colliding in the quiet morning air. He was used to giving orders, to working alone, to relying on his own strength and judgment. To be instructed, especially by a woman, was a foreign and unsettling experience. But there was a logic in her words, a quiet wisdom that cut through his stubborn pride. He looked at his horse, at the pain in its stance, and his resistance crumbled. He gave another curt nod. For the first time since Samuel's death, he let someone else lead. He fetched a bucket of water, and together, in the cool morning air, they worked to free the horse's hoof. He followed her instructions, pouring the water slowly, allowing it to soften the caked mud, using the pick not as a chisel but as a gentle probe, flaking away the dried clay layer by layer until the sharp, offending stone was finally revealed and removed. In town, Father Hanley stood on the steps of his small wooden church, watching the steady progress of the railroad crews on the edge of the valley. The clang of hammers on steel was a new and constant sound, the heartbeat of an inevitable future. He saw Barrett Mercer overseeing the work, a man who moved with the sharp, angular certainty of a surveyor's plumb line. The priest, a man whose face was a roadmap of compassion and worry, walked over to him. "Mr. Mercer," Father Hanley began, his voice mild. "A word, if I may." Mercer turned, his smile thin and professional. "Father, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "It's about the land," the priest said, getting straight to the point. "Some of my parishioners, they feel pressured. They are simple people, not men of business. They fear they are not getting a fair price for the legacy of their fathers." Mercer's smile didn't waver. "Progress requires sacrifice. Father, I am offering them more than a fair price. I am offering them a future. This railroad will connect Barlow Flats to the rest of the world. It will bring prosperity, opportunity." "Prosperity for whom?" Hanley asked gently. "Your methods are aggressive. There's a hardness in them. The Lord teaches us mercy, compassion in our dealings." Mercer gave a short, dry laugh. "I appreciate the sermon. Father, I truly do. But this isn't a church bazaar. This is the Union Pacific Railroad. It doesn't wait for the meek or the merciful. It lays its tracks and moves on." He gestured to the crews working in the distance. "The future waits for no man, not even Silas Boone." The name hung in the air between them, a point of contention as solid as a granite boulder. Father Hanley sighed, a sad, weary sound. He knew he had made no impact. He was speaking a language of the soul to a man who only understood the language of the ledger. Back at the ranch, Mercury was walking soundly, his limp gone. Eliza was packing her bag, preparing to leave. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but comfortable, filled with the shared satisfaction of a task completed. "Thank you," Silas said. The words felt strange in his mouth, rusty from disuse. "A good animal shouldn't suffer for a bit of bad luck," she replied, latching her bag. She hesitated, then spoke again, her tone conversational. "You know, back in Santa Vespera, where I'm from, a horse like this would be a showpiece, not a work animal." Santa Vespera. Silas repeated the name. It sounded impossibly distant and civilized. "What's a city woman doing all the way out here?" A faint, wry smile touched her lips. "I suppose I was looking for work that mattered more than just looking good. I was a nurse in the city hospital. A good one. I was even engaged to be married. To a doctor." She paused, her gaze distant, as if looking back down a long and winding road. "It was a comfortable life, predictable, but I kept hearing stories about places like this, about people in small settlements and on ranches who had no one, a broken bone, a bad fever. It could be a death sentence out here. I felt a calling." The confession was unexpected. Silas found himself genuinely curious. He leaned against the corral fence, his customary guard lowered by a fraction. "What did they say?" he asked. "The doctor, your family." Eliza looked at him directly, and he saw a flash of the same stubborn strength he recognized in himself. "They said I was being foolish, reckless, that I was throwing away a perfectly good life." She gave a small shrug. "I told them that a heart needs its own road, just like a wagon does. Sometimes the mapped and graded path just doesn't lead where you need to go." As she spoke, the wind gusted. A sudden, violent shove of cold air that whipped her hair across her face and made the hem of her dress dance. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself against the sudden chill. Without thinking, Silas moved. It was a pure, uncalculated reflex. He shrugged off his heavy duster, the one that was like a second skin to him, and draped it over her shoulders. His hand, large and calloused, brushed against the side of her neck, his fingers grazing her shoulder. The contact was electric. For him, the warmth of her skin was a shocking, terrifying jolt. He snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove, the memory of flame and pain flashing through him. For Eliza, the touch was a sudden, intimate warmth that broke through her own careful reserve. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. They both stepped back at the same instant, two magnets of the same polarity, repelling each other with an invisible, undeniable force. The shared duster was a bridge between them, but the space that had opened up was a chasm. The moment passed. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was thick with everything they weren't saying. Eliza clutched the heavy coat around her, the lingering scent of leather, dust, and Silas himself a strangely comforting presence. "I should go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He just nodded, his face an unreadable mask once more. He watched her climb into her wagon and drive away, his duster still around her shoulders, a piece of himself sent out into the world he tried so hard to keep at a distance. Later that week, the post office in Barlow Flats was busier than usual, one by one. Ranchers and farmers from the surrounding valley came in. They were quiet, their faces grim, and they walked up to the counter where one of Barrett Mercer's clerks sat with a stack of legal documents and a pot of ink. They signed their names on the dotted lines, their movements slow and resigned, trading their birthrights for a handful of railroad dollars. The scratch of the pen was the sound of an era ending. Mercer stood by the window, observing the proceedings with a detached satisfaction. He collected the signed deeds, scanning the list of names: Hatcher, Miller, Schmidt, all the small landowners who had bowed to the inevitable. He flipped through the pages, his eyes sharp and cold. He reached the end of the stack. His thumb ran down the list one last time. His expression hardened, his mouth tightening into a thin, bloodless line. The one name that mattered, the one parcel of land that formed the linchpin of his entire plan, was not there. Boone. The space beside the name was starkly, defiantly, empty. Mercer's eyes narrowed, the cool gray turning to the color of polished steel, as cold and sharp as the edge of a knife. The day had died under a bruised and swollen sky. There was no gentle twilight, only a premature, suffocating darkness that pressed down on Barlow Flats, silencing the evening birds and sending a nervous energy through the livestock. The air grew thick, heavy, and unnaturally still, as if the world were holding its breath before a sneeze. And then the sneeze came, a sudden, violent exhalation of wind that tore through the valley like a freight train, bending trees to their breaking point and ripping the dust from the street in a blinding, choking cloud. Rain followed not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the wooden buildings with the force of thrown gravel. Inside her makeshift clinic, Eliza Hart was trying to secure the window shutters when the first great roar of the storm hit the stable. The entire structure groaned, the old timbers complaining under the assault. A loose board on the roof, one she had been meaning to ask the blacksmith to fix, began to bang with a frantic, percussive rhythm against the main beam. Each slam was a sledgehammer blow that vibrated through the floor. She watched in horror as the edge of the canvas patch she'd nailed over a hole in the roof began to peel back, flapping wildly, letting in a spray of cold rain. If that went, the whole roof might follow. There was no time to find help. There was only the immediate, pressing crisis. Gritting her teeth, Eliza threw open the stable door, wrestling it against the force of the wind. She grabbed a coil of rope she kept for securing her wagon and scrambled onto a stack of hay bales, using them to hoist herself up onto the low, sloping roof. The world outside was a chaotic symphony of wind and water. The rain was a physical force, plastering her hair to her face and soaking her dress in seconds. The wind tried to tear her from her perch, a malevolent, invisible hand shoving at her back. She crawled on her hands and knees across the slick, treacherous shingles, the banging of the loose board growing louder, more desperate. She reached the anchor point, a thick iron ring bolted to the main crossbeam. The rope that was meant to be securing the far edge of the roof had come loose from its mooring on the other side and was now whipping about like a crazed snake. She had to catch it, pull it taut, and tie it down before the wind could peel the roof back like the lid of a tin can. She managed to snag the end of the rope, the rough hemp burning her cold hands. She braced her feet and pulled, leaning back with all her weight, but the main anchor knot, the one securing the rope to the iron ring, had been tightened by seasons of sun and rain into a woody, unforgiving fist of fiber. She couldn't get enough slack to tie off the loose end. She had to loosen the primary knot first. She clawed at it, her fingers numb and clumsy, but it wouldn't give. A flash of lightning bleached the world white for a terrifying, eternal second. In its stark light, she saw the entire roof structure lift just an inch before slamming back down. Close on its heels came a clap of thunder so violent it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The roof shuddered beneath her, and her wet boots slipped on the slick shingles. She cried out, a small sound swallowed by the storm, as she slid, her grip on the rope the only thing keeping her from being pitched into the churning mud below. Just as her strength was about to give out, a shape emerged from the deluge. A man, tall and solid, moving with a purpose that seemed to defy the chaos of the storm. It was Silas Boone. He strode into the small circle of light cast by the clinic's lantern, the rain sluicing off the brim of his hat. He didn't shout or call out. He simply looked up, his pale eyes assessing the situation in an instant, with a familiar, almost reverent motion. He took off his hat and placed it on the ground, weighting it with a rock so the wind wouldn't claim it. Then he was climbing, his movements swift and certain, finding handholds where Eliza had seen none. He was on the roof in seconds, a steady, grounding presence beside her. He took the main rope from her trembling hands, his own large and sure. "The anchor knot!" she shouted over the wind, her voice thin and ragged. "It's too tight. If we just yank it, the beam might crack." She saw him nod, understanding immediately. The solution wasn't brute force, it was precision. It required a careful release of tension. Leaning close so he could hear her over the roar of the wind and rain, she yelled the instruction, the words torn from her lips and thrown into the storm. "Undo me, slowly." He flinched. It was barely perceptible. a slight tightening of his jaw, but in the flashes of lightning, she saw it. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable, and for a heartbeat, the storm, the roof, the danger, it all fell away. There was only his gaze, intense and questioning. She was talking about the roof, about the knot, about the strain on the wooden beams, but the words, echoing their first meeting at the bridge, landed in the air between them with a weight all their own, a plea that went far deeper than wood and rope. He didn't speak. He just turned his attention to the knot. He positioned himself beside her, his body shielding hers from the main force of the wind. He was so close she could feel the heat of him, could smell the scent of wet leather and pine from the trees he must have ridden through. His breath, warm and steady, ghosted against her cheek. He began to work, his fingers, surprisingly deft, probing the tight, swollen fibers of the knot. He didn't pull. He persuaded. He found the key strand and began to ease it, to work slack into the system, 1 millimeter at a time. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead and ran in rivulets down his neck, but his focus was absolute. He was undoing the knot, one careful, patient loop at a time. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the other side of the roof. The loose board she'd heard banging finally gave way. Ripped from its nails by a furious gust, it flew through the air, a dark, spinning projectile. Eliza saw it coming and cried out, but there was no time to move. In a purely instinctual motion, Silas spun, pulling her into him and covering her body with his own. The board struck his shoulder with a sickening thud before ricocheting off into the darkness. He grunted in pain but held his position, his strong arms wrapped around her, keeping her steady, anchoring her to the roof and to himself. The world was just the hammering of the rain, the solid wall of his chest, and the frantic beat of her own heart. Below, in the relative shelter of a deep, shadowed alleyway across the street, 3 men watched the drama unfold. They were huddled against the wall, pretending to be nothing more than travelers caught in the storm. But their eyes were fixed on the stable, on the 2 figures silhouetted against the light. They saw the near miss with the board, and one of them let out a low, guttural laugh that was quickly swallowed by the wind. They were not concerned observers. They were wolves, waiting. The moment of danger passed. Silas slowly released her, his eyes searching her face. "You all right?" he shouted. She could only nod. Her voice caught in her throat. A thin line of blood trickled from a shallow gash on her cheek where a splinter from the board had grazed her. He saw it, and his expression hardened. He turned back to the roof, his movements now more urgent, and with a final, powerful twist, he freed the anchor knot. Working together, they pulled the loose section of roof back into place and used the slack in the rope to lash it down, securing it against the storm. The work was done. The roof was stable, exhausted and soaked to the bone. They carefully made their way down. They didn't speak. They sat together on the narrow wooden bench on the covered porch, just outside the stable door, watching the rain fall in relentless gray curtains. Water dripped from the tips of their hair, from their chins, from the cuffs of their sleeves, forming a small, steady pool at their feet. The fury of the storm was now just a backdrop, a distant roar. In the small bubble of their shared silence, the world felt strangely peaceful. Eliza finally broke the quiet. "You're hurt," she said softly, gesturing to the tear in his shirt where the board had struck him. He glanced down, dismissing it with a shrug. "It's nothing. Let me be the judge of that." She insisted. She got up and went inside, returning a moment later with her medical bag. In the dim lantern light, she dabbed at the cut on his shoulder, cleaning it with a practiced, gentle touch. Then she saw the gash on his own cheek, deeper than hers. "You're bleeding too." He started to protest, but she silenced him with a look. She threaded a needle with a fine, dark silk. "Hold still," she commanded softly. He obeyed, his body rigid as she leaned in close. Her fingers were surprisingly warm against his cold, wet skin as she held the edges of the cut together. The needle dipped and rose, a tiny, glinting silver fish swimming through his skin. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her focus absolute. The air grew thick with unspoken things. He watched her, not the needle. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way a stray strand of wet hair clung to her temple, the steady resolve in her green eyes. The storm raged on around them, but in that small space, there was only the quiet prick of the needle and the slow, heavy beat of his own heart. When she finished, she knotted the thread and snipped it with a tiny pair of scissors. Her hand lingered for a moment, her thumb gently brushing the skin beside the neat row of new stitches. He opened his mouth, the prelude to words he hadn't known he was going to say. A thank you, an apology, something more. The words formed in his mind, but they caught in his throat, a tangled knot of their own. He looked at her shivering in her thin, soaked dress, and the impulse to speak was replaced by a more familiar, more practical one. He reached over, took the edges of his heavy duster, which she had left on the bench when she went inside, and pulled it more securely around her shoulders, tucking it in as if she were a child. It was a simple, protective gesture, an act that said everything his voice could not. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and questioning in the lantern light. She leaned into the warmth of the coat, a silent acceptance of the gesture. They sat there for a long moment, two solitary figures adrift in a world of water and wind. Across the street, in the darkest corner of the alley, the storm provided cover for a different kind of preparation. One of the watching men fumbled with a burlap sack. A muffled clinking of glass broke the rhythm of the rain. The sack slipped from his wet fingers, falling to the muddy ground with a soft thud. It fell open, and for a brief second, a flash of lightning illuminated its contents. 2 glass oil lamps, their wicks trimmed, their reservoirs full. They were tools not for light, but for fire. A quiet, deadly preparation for a different kind of flood, another kind of storm that was yet to come. The morning broke, clean and sharp, the air scrubbed raw by the storm. A weak sun filtered through the retreating clouds, making the puddles in the street gleam like scattered silver coins. The world felt newborn, every surface washed, every scent heightened the clean tang of wet pine from the hills, the rich, dark smell of rain-soaked earth. It was into this clean new world that a foul and alien odor intruded. Eliza stood on the porch of the stable, surveying the night's damage. The roof had held, thanks to Silas. A few shingles were missing, and the ground was littered with twigs and leaves. But the clinic itself was sound. She breathed in the fresh morning air, and that's when she caught it. A greasy, acrid smell clinging to the damp wood of the porch railing. She leaned closer. It wasn't the familiar, clean scent of kerosene from her lamp. This was thicker, heavier, an industrial smell that spoke of machinery and soot. It was the smell of something deliberately foul. Her eyes followed the scent down to the muddy ground. There, half hidden under the porch steps, were the faint impressions of several boot prints that were not her own. They were deep, made by heavy men, and the mud clinging to the wood was wrong. It wasn't the uniform reddish-brown clay of Barlow Flats. It was darker, and as she knelt for a closer look, she saw that it was flecked with tiny, black, glittering particles. It was grit, slick with the same greasy substance she could smell on the air. Coal dust. A horse's steady hoofbeats on the wet road made her look up. Silas was riding toward her, his duster her duster. She corrected herself with a faint blush draped over the front of his saddle. He pulled Mercury to a halt, his face as grim and gray as the morning clouds. He had come for his coat, but his eyes were scanning the stable, the roof, her face, checking for damage. "Morning," he grunted, swinging down from the saddle. "The roof held," she said, her voice quiet. "Thank you." He just nodded, his gaze averted, as if the words of thanks were a burden. He reached for his duster, but she stopped him with a gesture. "Wait, look at this." She pointed to the dark, gritty mud. "And the smell. Do you recognize it?" He knelt, his long frame folding with an easy grace. He scraped a bit of the mud onto his finger, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. He sniffed it, his expression unchanging, but a new tension gathering in his shoulders. Coal slag, he said, his voice a low rumble. And crude oil, not lamp oil. He looked around, his pale eyes missing nothing. There's only one place near here that has mud like this. The railroad depot. She finished for him. The temporary yard where they brought in the supplies, where the locomotives sat hissing and spitting coal smoke, a place few townspeople ever went. He stood up, wiping his hand on his pants. His face was a closed door. It's nothing, he said, the words flat and final. Wind blows all sorts of things around. This wasn't the wind. Silas, she insisted, her voice sharp with urgency. There were men here. I saw them from the roof. They were watching us. Let it be, Eliza. His tone was hard, a clear warning. You stir a hornet's nest. You're the one who gets stung. I've got enough trouble without inviting more to my doorstep. He saw the world in simple, brutal terms. Mind your own business, and the trouble might, just might, pass you by. It was the survival instinct of a man who had already lost too much. She looked at him, at the stubborn set of his jaw, at the profound weariness in his eyes. She understood his fear, his desire to be left alone in his fortress of solitude. But she also saw the fallacy in it. The boot prints were already under her porch. The trouble was already here. Being left alone isn't the same as being safe, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised them both. And being safe only protects yourself. Sometimes not even then. What happens when Mercer's men decide to light a fire instead of just watching from the shadows? Who will be safe then? He stared at her, the silence between them charged and heavy. Her words were a direct challenge to the creed he had lived by for too long, lonely years. He saw the fire in her eyes, a reflection of the one that haunted his dreams, and he knew she was right. His silence, his isolation, it wasn't a shield. It was just a cage. Without another word, he turned and strode toward his horse. For a moment, she thought he was leaving, abandoning her and the problem. But instead of mounting, he simply checked the cinch on his saddle, a small, practical motion that was also a decision. He looked back at her. Stay here, he commanded. I'll go. No, she said, walking to her own wagon. We go together. He started to argue, but the look on her face told him it was useless. He let out a long, frustrated sigh, a sound of bitter resignation. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and now he was tied to this stubborn, clear-eyed woman who refused to let him retreat. They followed the railroad tracks out of town, a raw, fresh scar across the rain-washed land. The steel rails gleamed, an alien presence in the natural landscape. The depot was a chaotic jumble of stacked lumber, iron rails, and tar paper shacks. The air hung thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. A few rough-looking men watched them approach, their faces suspicious and hostile, but no one moved to stop them. They didn't have to search for long. Behind a large stack of railroad ties, partially hidden under a canvas tarp, were 3 large wooden barrels. The words Union Pacific were stenciled on their sides in black paint. A dark, greasy liquid had seeped from the spigot of one barrel, pooling on the ground and creating the same black, gritty mud Eliza had found on her porch. The smell was overpowering. And then Silas saw it. His body went still. He pointed with a rigid finger. Lying coiled beside the barrels was a length of thick hemp rope, its fibers dark and saturated with the oil. It wasn't just a rope. It had been prepared, turned into a giant fuse. Lying next to it was a small pile of freshly cut wooden stakes, their tips sharpened to a point, survey markers. He walked forward slowly, as if approaching a venomous snake. He followed the line of the tracks with his eyes, looking toward the low hills that marked the edge of his own property. And there they were. More stakes, driven into the ground, a neat straight line that cut a full 20 yards inside his own fence line. It was a silent, arrogant declaration. Mercer wasn't just trying to intimidate him. He was actively carving up his land, claiming it before it was even his. A voice cut through the air, carrying from one of the shacks. I tell you, Mercer, it was a waste of good oil. A storm like that, a fire would never have caught. It was the railroad foreman, his voice rough, and then Mercer's voice, smooth and cold as river stone. A setback. Nothing more. The seasonal flood didn't do our work for us. It seems we'll have to arrange for another. Silas and Eliza froze. Hidden behind the stack of ties, the words confirmed everything. The threat she had overheard. The men at the stable, the oil, the rope, it was all part of a deliberate, calculated plan. A plan to burn him out, to create their own flood of fire and ruin. Eliza's mind worked quickly. A report to the sheriff would be useless. It would be her word against a powerful man like Mercer. They needed proof, while Silas stood rigid with a cold, contained fury. She moved. Her actions were swift and silent. She knelt by the oil-soaked rope, her back to the shacks. From her medical bag, she pulled out a clean linen bandage, with a small, sharp knife from her kit. She sawed off a 6-inch section of the rope. The stench was nauseating. She quickly wrapped the piece of rope in the bandage, creating a neat, white parcel, and tucked it deep into the pocket of her dress. It was evidence, clean and damning, collected with the sterile precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. They backed away slowly, melting back into the jumble of supplies, and made their way off the railroad property without being seen. They didn't speak on the ride back. The shared knowledge of what they had discovered was a heavy weight between them. The landscape, which had seemed so clean and new that morning, now felt charged with menace, every shadow seeming to hide a threat. As they reached the edge of his property, Silas finally broke the silence. He looked at her calm profile, her hands steady on the reins. He thought of the risk she had just taken, the cool, deliberate way she had collected the evidence. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked, his voice low and raw. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw the tremor in her hands, the faint, dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes. She was afraid, but she wasn't broken by it. "Yes," she said, her voice perfectly even. "I'm terrified, but I've learned that there are things in this world to be more afraid of than being scared, and the most frightening thing I can think of is doing nothing at all." That night, she came to his ranch. It was safer there, far from the prying eyes of the town. In the quiet of his barn, lit by a single, steady lantern, they needed to find a place to hide the evidence. The wrapped piece of rope felt hot and dangerous in Eliza's hand, a coiled secret that could get them both killed. "Here," Silas said, opening a large wooden chest in the corner. It was filled with horse liniment, bottles of tonic, and clean rags, his veterinary supplies. He pushed aside a bottle of colic medicine. "No one will look for it here. It'll just smell like horse cure." It was the perfect place, mundane and overlooked. Eliza leaned forward to place the small parcel into the space he had cleared. At the same moment, he reached in to adjust a bottle. Their hands brushed in the tight space. It was a simple, accidental touch, but after the tension of the day, it was like a lit match in a dark room. They both recoiled as if they had received an electric shock. Their nerves stretched taut. They looked at each other, wide-eyed in the lantern light, their shared jumpiness a stark admission of the fear they were both trying so hard to control. And then, a strange thing happened. A small smile touched the corner of Eliza's mouth. A quiet, breathy laugh escaped her. Silas stared at her for a second, and then, to his own profound surprise, he felt the tight knot of tension in his own chest loosen. A low chuckle rumbled from deep in his throat. It was a strange, rusty sound, a piece of machinery that hadn't been used in years. The shared laughter wasn't loud or joyous. It was small, quiet, and incredibly warm. A tiny spark of light and sanity in the encroaching darkness. It was the sound of two lonely people realizing, perhaps for the first time, that they were not entirely alone. They didn't know that on the rocky ridge overlooking the ranch, a man was watching the faint lantern light spilling from the barn. He sat perfectly still, a lone figure in the vast, dark landscape. He raised a hand-rolled cigarette to his lips, the ember glowing a fierce, predatory red in the blackness. He took a long, slow drag, the smoke pluming from his nostrils in a gray sigh. He watched, and he waited. Whispers travel faster than a prairie fire in a dry wind. The rumor began as a low murmur in the smoky confines of the Barlow Flats saloon, likely sparked by a disgruntled railroad worker who'd seen Silas and Eliza at the depot. A word here, a knowing glance there. By noon, the whisper had grown into a confident assertion passed between the general store and the blacksmith's forge. Boone has something on the railroad. He's got proof. The words were a currency of their own, traded with a mixture of fear and a grim, satisfying excitement. In a town simmering with resentment against Mercer's heavy-handed tactics, the idea of a secret weapon was a potent one. Eliza was oblivious to the storm gathering in the town's undercurrents. She was in her clinic, her world narrowed to the small, feverish face of the blacksmith's daughter. The girl had a nasty cough, and Eliza was focused on listening to her breathing, her ear pressed to the child's small back. The air in the stable was calm, filled only with the scent of hay and the minty aroma of the poultice she was preparing. Silas arrived not with a shout, but as a sudden shadow filling the doorway. He didn't enter. He stood on the threshold, his body tense, his eyes scanning the street behind him. Eliza looked up, a question on her face, but the look in his eyes silenced it. It was a look she had never seen before, not guarded or weary, but sharp, alert, like a hawk spotting a snake in the grass. He saw the child on the cot, the worried mother beside her. His gaze flickered back to the street. He saw them then. 3 riders, sitting their horses at the far end of the town, their stillness a coiled threat. They were too far to see their faces, but he didn't need to. They wore dark bandanas pulled high over their noses, a deliberate and menacing anonymity. They weren't cowboys. They were hunters. Silas's decision was instantaneous. He looked at Eliza, his voice a low, urgent command that cut through the quiet clinic. "Back door, now!" The blacksmith's wife looked up in alarm, but Eliza's calm was absolute. She placed a reassuring hand on the woman's arm. "It's all right. Mary, take Annie home. Keep her warm. I'll come by this evening to check on her." She handed the woman a small jar of salve, her movements unhurried, projecting a confidence she did not feel. She was buying them seconds. The mother, trusting and frightened, gathered her daughter and scurried out the back entrance of the stable, disappearing toward her home. The moment they were gone, the facade of calm dropped. "What is it?" Eliza asked, her voice low as she moved toward Silas. "They know," he said, the 2 words carrying the weight of everything. He grabbed her medical bag from the table. "They know we have the proof." He pushed the bag into her hands and took her arm. "We can't stay here." He guided her toward the rear exit, the one that opened onto a narrow, rock-strewn alley. "We go through Dry Needle." Dry Needle Canyon wasn't a canyon so much as a deep, jagged scar in the earth, a shortcut through the hills that was notoriously treacherous. It was a narrow, winding passage with high rock walls, wide enough for a single horse in some places, 2 in others. It was a place for emergencies, not for travel. It was also their only chance. They moved quickly, Silas leading Mercury, Eliza scrambling to keep up. The alley opened up behind the town, and they were exposed for 100 yards of open ground before the mouth of the canyon. They ran, the only sounds their own ragged breaths and the frantic thud of Mercury's hooves on the soft earth. They were almost there. The shadow of the canyon entrance was just feet away. The first shot came with a sharp crack that was completely alien to the natural sounds of the valley. It wasn't the deep boom of a hunting rifle. It was the high, angry retort of a pistol. The bullet didn't come close, but it didn't need to. It slammed into the rock wall just above their heads, and a shower of stone chips and dust rained down on them. Mercury shied violently, his eyes rolling, his body trembling. Silas held the reins tight, his voice a low, calming rumble in the horse's ear, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting around them. They were in the canyon now. Hoofbeats echoed from behind them, amplified by the narrow rock walls. Their pursuers had entered the chase, the path twisted, a ribbon of broken stone and sand. Silas glanced over his shoulder. 2 of the riders were gaining on them. The third was further back, taking his time. Silas scanned the terrain ahead, his mind working with the speed of pure instinct. He saw what he was looking for, a dead, sun-bleached log, thick as a man's waist, wedged high up on a narrow ledge about 10 feet up the canyon wall. He pushed the reins into Eliza's hands. "Keep him moving," he yelled. He uncoiled the lariat from his saddle. He ran alongside them, his boots slipping on the loose rock, his eyes fixed on the target, in one fluid, practiced motion, the kind born of 1,000 mornings spent roping cattle. He spun the loop and sent it sailing upward. It settled perfectly around the end of the log. He didn't stop running. He dug his heels into the ground, pulling the rope taut, using his and Mercury's forward momentum as an anchor. The log groaned, shifted, and then tumbled from the ledge with a splintering crash. It landed squarely across the narrow path, a solid, immovable barricade. The two lead riders reined in hard, their horses rearing and screaming as they were forced to a sudden, sliding halt before the unexpected obstacle. It was a perfect, desperate, beautiful move, but the third rider had been hanging back. He'd seen the trap. With a wild yell, he spurred his horse, not at the path, but at the steep, scree-covered side of the canyon. His horse was a powerful beast, and it scrambled for purchase, sending a cascade of loose rock tumbling down. But it found its footing. He was going around the barricade. He was going to cut them off. He cleared the log and spurred his horse into a dead gallop, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. The man was big, his face a mask of grim intent beneath the bandana. As he drew alongside them, he pulled not a gun, but a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the canyon gloom. There was no room to maneuver. Silas was on the far side of Mercury, unable to get between the rider and Eliza. The man reached out, grabbing for her, the knife held low and ready. Eliza reacted. There was no time for fear, only for action. She was still clutching Mercury's reins in one hand, but her other was free. As the man's arm reached for her, she swung her body hard, using the motion to drive the heavy iron horn of the saddle pommel directly into the man's extended wrist. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the narrow space. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and surprise. The knife flew from his nerveless fingers, spinning end over end before clattering onto the rocks. The impact and the sudden, excruciating pain broke his balance. He toppled sideways from his saddle, a clumsy, sprawling fall, and hit the ground hard. His horse, riderless and panicked, galloped on past them and disappeared around the next bend. They didn't stop. They didn't look back. The path ahead narrowed even further, becoming a tight, claustrophobic passage between two sheer walls of granite. It was barely wide enough for the horse. Silas pushed ahead, leading them into the tightest part of the squeeze, a place where the rock walls were so close they scraped against his shoulders. He stopped, pulling Mercury to a halt behind him. He could hear the shouts of the other two riders as they worked to clear the log. They would be through in minutes. He turned to Eliza. The adrenaline was still coursing through her, her face pale, her eyes wide. He reached out, his hands finding her shoulders, and pushed her gently but firmly back, pressing her into a shallow alcove in the rock wall, a space barely deep enough to conceal a person. Then he stepped in front of her, his own body completely shielding her from the path. He stood with his back to the rock, facing the direction they had come, his body a human shield against the wind, against the coming bullets, against the world. They were inches apart. He could feel her ragged breathing against his back. He could smell the faint scent of mint from the poultice she had been making, a scent of healing in a place of violence. For the first time, he spoke to her not in commands, but in a request. His voice was low, stripped of all its usual defenses, a raw and honest sound. "Trust me," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a plea, the first he had ever made. He felt, rather than saw, her nod. He felt her breath hitch, a warm touch against the cold skin of his neck just above his collar, in that small, protected space, with danger closing in. A new and fragile connection was forged in the silence. The shouts were closer now. He knew they couldn't stay there. He glanced down at the medical bag she still clutched in her hand. "What's in there?" he asked, his mind racing. "Bandages, salves, tinctures," she began, her mind still catching up. "Anything else? Powders, chemicals?" "Sulfur," she said, her eyes widening as she understood. "For treating skin ailments, and powdered charcoal." "Get it," he said. Her hands, now steady, opened the bag. She pulled out 2 small, cloth-wrapped packets. He took the sulfur. He peered around the edge of the rock. The riders were coming, moving slowly now, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of movement. "When I throw this," he whispered, "run. Don't look back. Just run." He waited until they were 30 yards away. Then he leaned out and threw the packet with all his strength. It hit the ground directly in front of the lead horse, bursting open in a cloud of fine, yellow dust. He immediately followed it with the charcoal. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The cloud of sulfur and charcoal dust filled the narrow canyon. A thick, choking, foul-smelling smoke. It wasn't poisonous, but it was blinding and suffocating. The horses, their sensitive nostrils filled with the acrid stench, panicked. They reared, whinnying in terror, fighting their riders, refusing to move forward into the blinding, stinking cloud. "Go!" Silas yelled, grabbing Eliza's hand and pulling her from the alcove. They ran. They scrambled over rocks, their lungs burning, their legs aching. They ran from the sounds of cursing men and screaming horses, leaving the chaos behind them. They burst out of the far end of the canyon and into open meadowland. The green grass and wide sky, a shocking contrast to the claustrophobic rock passage. And then the heavens opened. A sudden, unforecasted downpour began, the rain coming down in cool, cleansing sheets. It was a miracle. It washed the dust from their faces, cooled their overheated bodies, and, most importantly, it obliterated their tracks. Within minutes, any sign of their passage across the meadow was gone, washed away as if they had never been. They finally collapsed, gasping for air, under the shelter of a thick grove of pine trees at the far side of the meadow, watching the rain fall. They were safe, for now, miles away, on a high ridge overlooking the valley. Barrett Mercer lowered his field glasses. He had watched the entire chase unfold, a silent observer to the failure of his men. He had seen the log barricade, the fall of the third rider, the final, desperate escape. He felt no anger, only a cold, intellectual curiosity. His plan, his seasonal flood, had been crude, effective against a simple rancher, perhaps, but Boone was proving to be more resourceful. And the woman was a complete unknown, a variable he had not properly accounted for. He closed the field glasses with a soft, metallic click. A thin, humorless smile touched his lips. The plan would have to change. It would have to become more subtle, more sophisticated, more like the railroad itself, less a flash flood, and more like a slow, steady, inexorable track of steel, crushing everything in its path. The town sheriff had been gone for a week, called away to a territorial dispute 2 counties over. In his absence, the law in Barlow Flats was a vacuum, a space Barrett Mercer was more than happy to fill with the weight of his contracts and the intimidation of his men. But there was another authority in the valley, one that didn't rely on badges or guns. Father Hanley, seeing the town wound tight as a watch spring and fearing it might snap, did the only thing he could. He declared that a public inquiry would be held, not in a courthouse, for they had none, but in the house of God. The church was packed. People stood in the aisles and crowded the doorway, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a desperate hunger for justice. It was not a court of law, but a court of conscience, and the entire town had been called to serve as its jury. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed through the tall, plain glass windows, illuminating the scene with an almost theatrical solemnity. Barrett Mercer stood before the altar, which Father Hanley was using as an impromptu bench. He was the picture of calm, corporate authority, his dark suit an affront to the simple, sun-bleached attire of the townsfolk. He held up a sheaf of papers. The loan agreement, its clauses and conditions a testament to the inexorable logic of commerce. The facts, Father, are not in dispute, Mercer began, his voice smooth and reasonable, yet carrying to every corner of the silent church. Mr. Boone took a loan from the Barlow Flats Bank, an institution now under the purview of the Union Pacific Railroad. He pledged his land as collateral. The date for repayment, as you can see, has passed. The terms are explicit. On this day, by the letter of the law, the Boone Ranch and all its holdings become the property of the railroad. He placed the contract on the altar with a sound of crisp finality. It was simple. It was legal. It was, in his world, the end of the argument. Father Hanley looked at the papers, his brow furrowed. He then looked to Silas, who stood beside Eliza near the front pew. Silas had said nothing. His face was a stone mask, his hands clenched at his sides. He was a man of action, not of words. And in this arena of rhetoric and legal documents, he was hopelessly outmatched. And what of the allegations of intimidation? Father Hanley asked, his voice quiet but firm. Of threats made against Mr. Boone. Mercer gave a dismissive shrug. The idle gossip of a small town. Father, understandably, people are resistant to change, but progress, as I've said, waits for no man. We have a legally binding contract. Anything else is hearsay and irrelevant. Is it? A clear, calm voice cut through the heavy silence. All heads turned to Eliza Hart. She stepped forward, her simple dress a stark contrast to Mercer's tailored suit. She held no legal document, only a small, white linen parcel. She looked not at Mercer, but directly at Father Hanley and the assembled townsfolk. On the night of the storm, she began, her voice steady and clear. Mr. Boone came to my aid when the roof of my clinic was damaged. While we were on that roof, men were watching from across the street. The next morning, I found this on my porch. She began to unwrap the parcel. It is mud, but it is not the mud of this town. It is dark, greasy, and filled with fine particles of coal. There is only one place in this valley with mud like that, the railroad's temporary depot. A low murmur went through the crowd. I also found the source of a foul, oily smell. She continued, her voice never wavering. She held up the unwrapped object. It was the 6-inch piece of oil-soaked rope. This is not common lamp oil. It is a crude, industrial lubricant, the same kind that is stored in barrels at the depot. This rope was deliberately soaked in it, prepared as a fuse. My medical opinion is that it was intended to accelerate a fire. The murmur grew louder. Mercer's face, for the first time, lost its placid composure. A flicker of cold anger appeared in his eyes. This is absurd, he snapped. A traveling nurse with a wild imagination. What does any of this prove? It proves intent. Mr. Mercer, Eliza said, her gaze finally locking with his, and it connects that intent directly to your property. A piece of rope and a patch of mud, he scoffed. This is a desperate fantasy. There is more, Father Hanley said, his voice cutting off Mercer's tirade. He looked toward the back of the church. Mr. Abernathy, would you please come forward? A man detached himself from the shadows near the door. He was a woodcutter, a big man with a gentle, worried face, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. He walked slowly up the aisle, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, clearly terrified of being the center of attention. Mr. Abernathy, Father Hanley said gently, please, just tell us what you told me. The woodcutter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Well, Father, about a week ago, a fella hired me, paid me cash money, said he was with the railroad. He glanced nervously at Mercer. He didn't give a name. He just gave me a map and told me to cut a dozen survey stakes and drive them into the ground right where the map showed. And where did the map show? The priest prompted. Abernathy took a deep breath. It was on Boone's land, well inside his fence line, a straight line, cutting right across his north pasture. The silence in the church was now absolute, a heavy, ringing void. The pieces had clicked into place. The intimidation, the depot, the prepared rope, the pre-staked claim on land that wasn't yet theirs. It painted a picture not of legal business, but of a predatory conspiracy. Mercer's face was a thundercloud. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to threaten. But Father Hanley held up a hand. "This is not a court of law," the priest said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "I cannot rule on the legality of this contract, but this is a house of God, and I can rule on the morality of the actions that surround it. There is a shadow of profound bad faith here, Mr. Mercer, a stench of malice." He looked from Mercer to Silas, then out at the sea of faces. "I am giving this town 3 days," he declared. 3 days for the truth to find its way fully into the light. I will send a rider to find Sheriff Miller and present him with this testimony. Until he returns and can make a proper inquiry, any and all action regarding the seizure of the Boone property is hereby suspended. It was a brilliant move. He had not broken the law, but he had frozen it in place with the sheer force of moral conviction. Mercer stood there, seething, his legal weapon rendered temporarily useless. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a lawyer, but by a small-town priest, a traveling nurse, and the simple, honest testimony of a woodcutter. Outside, the sky had turned a soft gray, and a light, misty rain had begun to fall. The crowd dispersed slowly, talking in hushed, excited tones. Silas and Eliza stood alone under the small overhang of the church porch, the cool, damp air, a relief after the suffocating tension inside. He stood for a long moment, just looking at her, at the way the misty light caught in her hair. He was a man drowning in a sea of trouble, and she had just thrown him a lifeline. The gratitude he felt was a powerful, unfamiliar force, and it left him without words. He took a half-step toward her, his body leaning in, his head dipping down as if to, what? Thank her, kiss her, he didn't know himself. His face was just inches from hers, and he could see the faint flecks of gold in her green eyes. He stopped there, suspended in that small space, a safe distance from a line he was terrified to cross. "Don't make promises while we're still running," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the patter of the rain. She had seen the look in his eyes, the promise he was about to make without speaking, and she knew it was a promise born of gratitude and desperation, not of peace. A slow, tired smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. It transformed him, erasing some of the harsh lines etched there by grief and solitude. "Then I'll slow down," he said, his voice a low, soft vow. What happened next was a quiet miracle. The town, which had for so long held Silas at a fearful distance, began to close ranks around him. It started small. That evening, the blacksmith's wife, Mary, appeared at the Boone ranch with a freshly baked loaf of bread, her daughter's cough now completely gone. The next morning, others came. They didn't come to talk about the hearing or about Mercer. They came with offerings: a sack of flour from the miller, a dozen jars of preserves from a farmer's wife, a bag of corn and sugar from the general store. It was a spontaneous harvest festival of support, a quiet declaration of allegiance. By midday, the town square had been transformed into a bustling fundraising market, selling donated goods to raise money to help pay Boone's debt, Mercer's remaining men. The 2 riders from the Kenyon chase saw this and decided to put a stop to it. They rode into the square, their faces set in belligerent sneers, intending to overturn tables and scatter the crowd. But as they moved toward the center of the market, something strange happened. The townsfolk, the blacksmith, the miller, the farmers, the women simply stopped what they were doing and turned to face them. They formed a silent, human wall. They held no weapons. They shouted no insults. They just stood, and they watched. The riders slowed, their bluster faltering in the face of this united, immovable silence. It was more unnerving than any angry mob. There was no enemy to fight, no fear to exploit. There was only the calm, collective will of a community that had finally chosen its side. The silence was an accusation, a judgment, and a shield all at once, defeated by a weapon they couldn't comprehend. The men cursed under their breath, turned their horses, and rode away. The quiet power of a people standing together had proven stronger than threats and intimidation. 3 days, 72 hours that felt as long and drawn out as a winter drought. For 3 days, Barlow Flats held its breath. The railroad crews worked with a sullen, resentful energy, their hammers ringing with a hollow note. Mercer was a ghost, seen only as a silhouette in the window of the bank, a spider in the center of his web. The town, meanwhile, was a different entity altogether. The fear that had kept them isolated had been replaced by a fragile, tentative unity. People spoke to each other in the street, their conversations low, but their eyes meeting with a new sense of shared purpose. They were waiting. On the 3rd day, the rider sent to find Sheriff Miller returned, his horse lathered and his face grim. The sheriff was still a day's ride away, embroiled in a conflict that would not release him. But the rider brought back something else, notarized reports from the Territorial Assay Office confirming the composition of the mud sample Eliza had collected, and a copy of the Union Pacific Freight Manifest, obtained from the next major depot down the line. The bell of the small church began to toll, not for a service, but as a summons. Once again, the town gathered. The atmosphere was different this time. It was not the tense curiosity of the first hearing. The air was electric with anticipation. The pews filled not with spectators, but with stakeholders. They had baked bread and sold quilts for Silas Boone. His fight was now, in a small but significant way, their own. Father Hanley stood before them, his face weary but his back straight. Mercer was there, flanked by his 2 remaining men, his expression a mask of bored impatience, as if this were all a tedious formality before the inevitable conclusion. And near the front, Silas and Eliza stood side by side. They were a study in stillness. He, a monolith of contained tension. She, a pillar of quiet resolve. The priest raised a hand for silence, and the low hum of conversation immediately ceased. 2 days ago, he began, his voice clear and resonant. We gathered here to hear a complaint. We were presented with a legal contract, and we were presented with a story of malice. I suspended judgment to allow the facts to be sought. The facts have now returned. He held up a piece of paper. The assay office confirms that the mud found on the porch of the clinic is identical in composition to the mud at the railroad depot, a unique mixture of local clay, coal slag, and crude oil. It could not have come from anywhere else. He picked up a second paper. Furthermore, the freight manifest for the Union Pacific Depot in Barlow Flats shows the delivery, 2 weeks ago, of 3 barrels of industrial lubricant. These barrels were signed for by Mr. Mercer's own foreman. He looked directly at the foreman, whose face paled. The markings on those barrels, according to the manifest, would be a stenciled serial number. I invite the sheriff, upon his return, to inspect the barrels that are still sitting behind the depot and compare them to this manifest. The case was being built, piece by deliberate piece. It was a wall of evidence, solid and undeniable. Mercer finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. This is a fascinating exercise in local theater, Father, but it remains irrelevant. A patch of mud and a barrel of oil do not invalidate a legal and binding contract. Perhaps my men were careless. Perhaps they were even preparing to defend the railroad's rightfully claimed property against a man known for his stubborn and unpredictable nature. It's a volatile region. A man has a right to protect his assets. The argument was slick, a clever twist. He was painting himself as the prudent businessman, protecting his investment against a potential threat. But Eliza stepped forward. Protection? She asked, her voice cutting through his smooth rhetoric. By leaving a prepared fuse on the porch of a medical clinic, by hiring a man to drive stakes and claim a piece of property days before you even had a legal right to it, mister. Abernathy's testimony proves that your actions were not defensive, but aggressive. You weren't protecting an asset. You were preparing to seize one by force. The woodcutter's words, now reinforced by the physical evidence, had defeated Mercer's logic. He was exposed, his argument stripped bare, revealing the ugly ambition beneath. He had nothing left but the contract, "This is nonsense," he snarled, his composure finally cracking. "The contract is the only thing that matters. The law is on my side. That land is mine." "The law," Father Hanley said, his voice dropping, becoming as solemn as a prayer, "is intended to be a tool of justice. Mr. Mercer, not a bludgeon for the powerful. The letter of the law may be on your side, but its spirit has been grievously wounded." He picked up the loan agreement from the altar. He also picked up a pen, dipping it into a small pot of red ink he had placed there. "This contract calls for full repayment or forfeiture, but it also contains clauses for fees and penalties, accrued at a rate that I find to be predatory." He drew a thick, vicious red line through a long paragraph of fine print. "This punitive late fee is stricken. It is an offense against charity." He continued, "Given the clear evidence of intimidation and conspiracy to devalue and seize this property through illicit means, it is the judgment of this community that the terms of the debt must be altered." He looked at Silas. "The rains have been good this year. The grass will be rich. Your herd will be strong by the spring. This contract will be extended. You will have until the end of the next season to make repayment." It was not a cancellation of the debt, but it was a gift of the one thing Silas needed more than anything: time. All eyes in the church now turned to Silas Boone. This was his moment. The town had built a fortress around him, but he was the one who had to stand and defend it. He walked forward slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. He stopped at the altar, standing before Mercer, before the priest, before the entire town. He was no longer hiding in the shadows of his grief or his ranch. He was standing in the full, unforgiving light. And then he did something that held a significance no one but Eliza could fully grasp. He reached up and took off his hat. He didn't place it over his heart or hold it in his hands. He deliberately, and with a profound finality, set it down on the corner of the altar. It was the same gesture he'd made at the bridge, the same one he'd made in the storm. But this time, it wasn't a preparation for a physical task. It was a vow. It was the act of a man removing his final shield, standing exposed and accountable before his world. He looked directly at Barrett Mercer, his pale eyes clear and steady. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it filled the sacred space with its quiet, unshakable power. "I'm not selling," he said, the words slow and measured. "And I'm not leaving. I will pay the debt." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople who had stood for him. "I will pay every dollar, for every season it takes." It was a declaration of war and a promise of peace, all in one. Eliza stood where she was, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not reach for him, did not offer a comforting touch. Theirs was not a bond that needed to be displayed, but she gave a single, sharp nod. It was a small movement, but it was freighted with the weight of everything they had been through: the storm, the chase, the fear, the trust. It was as heavy and as solid as the roof they had saved together. A new sound broke the silence. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man with soot permanently ingrained in his skin, stepped forward. "I'll buy a piece of that debt," he said, his voice a low rumble. "At a fair rate. I'd rather Boone owed me than the railroad." Then the miller stepped forward. "And me." One by one, a half-dozen of the town's more prosperous farmers and merchants came forward, each pledging to buy a portion of Silas's loan from Mercer. It was a bloodless coup. The power of the debt, Mercer's primary weapon, was being dismantled and redistributed into the hands of the community. His leverage was dissolving before his eyes. Mercer stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been beaten. He snatched the contract from the altar, shoved it into his coat, and stormed out of the church without another word, his two henchmen trailing behind him like defeated dogs. The tension in the church broke. A low murmur of conversation, of relief, of victory, rippled through the crowd. They began to file out, clapping Silas on the back as they passed, shaking his hand. He accepted it all with a stoic, quiet grace, a man still unused to being a part of the world. Soon, the church was empty again. It was just the two of them, standing in a shaft of dusty sunlight. The charged energy of the confrontation had been replaced by a deep and profound quiet. Silas reached into his own coat pocket. He pulled out a small, square piece of white linen. It was the bandage she had given him at the bridge, the one she had used to wrap his wrist. He had washed it clean, and it was folded into a perfect, neat square. He held it out to her. She looked at the folded cloth, then up at his face. "Keep it," she said softly, "as a reminder to undo your knot slowly." A faint, wry smile touched his lips. He looked down at the cloth in his hand, then back at her, his pale eyes holding a warmth she had never seen there before. "With someone to remind me," he answered, his voice low and full of a meaning that went far beyond the words. "I'll remember." They walked out of the church and stood together on the top step, looking out at the town. The sky was clear, the air cool. A sense of peace had settled over the valley. Down the road, they could see Mercer's wagon, already a small speck, heading east, away from Barlow Flats. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, the two of them, a solitary rancher and a traveling nurse, brought together by a tangled rope, two shadows cast long in the afternoon sun, standing so close, yet not quite touching. A fragile peace had settled over Barlow Flats, as delicate as the new spider webs that glistened on the corral fences in the morning dew. The railroad crews had packed their equipment and moved on down the line, their noisy, aggressive progress replaced by the familiar, comforting sounds of the valley. The blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the chatter of children. Mercer was gone, a bad memory that was already beginning to fade like a cheap photograph left in the sun. The Boone debt, now owned in pieces by the very community that had once shunned him, was a manageable burden, a shared load. For the first time in 2 years, Silas Boone could ride across his own land and feel the tentative stirrings of hope. It was into this quiet, healing world that a letter arrived. It came with the weekly stagecoach, a dust-caked ghost from the outside world. The envelope was thick and creamy, a startling white against the rough wood of the post office counter. The handwriting was a crisp, elegant script, and the postmark read Santa Vespera. It was addressed to Eliza Hart. She held it in her hand, a tangible piece of the life she had left behind. She could almost feel the cool, polished corridors of the city hospital, hear the muted clatter of instruments on steel trays. She opened it with a strange sense of detachment, as if reading about someone else's life. The words inside, however, were aimed directly at her own. Dr. Alistair Finch, the chief of medicine, and the man she had once been engaged to, wrote with a formal, yet urgent, plea. The hospital was expanding. They had a new women's and children's ward. The position of head nurse was hers, if she wanted it. The salary he quoted was more than double what she could ever hope to earn in a dozen dusty settlements like Barlow Flats. It was a secure life, a respected position, a return to everything she had once thought she wanted. News, like water, finds its own level in a small town. By the time Silas rode in for supplies that afternoon, the postmaster had already shared the impressive details with half a dozen people. He found Eliza outside the general store, discussing a new poultice with the blacksmith's wife. She looked up as he approached. The letter, now folded into a neat square, held loosely in her hand. He stopped a few feet away, his body stiff. He had heard. He knew. The entire town knew. The fragile peace he had just begun to feel was already being threatened, not by an enemy with a gun, but by a piece of paper from a world he could not compete with. He thought of his ranch, of the coming winter, of the long, hard years of work it would take to pay his debt. What did he have to offer against a life of comfort and prestige? "Heard you got an offer?" he said, his voice carefully neutral, scraped clean of any emotion. She nodded, her eyes searching his for a reaction. "From the hospital in Santa Vespera, they want me to come back." He looked at the letter, then at the distant, hazy line of the mountains. He could feel the eyes of the town on them, watching, waiting. He had no right to ask her to stay. He had no right to offer her anything but more hardship, more solitude. He fell back on the only defense he had ever known, a flat, impenetrable stoicism. "Congratulations," he said. The word was a stone, dropped into a deep well. His voice was perfectly level, but his eyes were not. In their pale, winter sky depths, a storm was gathering, a flicker of something that looked like fear, a shadow of a loss he hadn't even allowed himself to acknowledge he might have, was there and then gone. He gave a curt nod, turned, and walked into the general store, the bell above the door jangling in the sudden, heavy silence. That night, the quiet in the small stable clinic felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was hollow. Eliza moved with a restless energy, unable to settle. The letter sat on her small table, a white rectangle of accusation. It represented a safe harbor, a known quantity. Barlow Flats was a wild, unpredictable sea, and Silas was a storm she wasn't sure she could survive. She found herself chopping vegetables, the rhythmic, mindless work. A comfort, an onion, 2 carrots, a handful of potatoes. She built a small fire in the cast-iron stove the blacksmith had given her and set a pot of water to boil. The familiar, savory scent of soup began to fill the small space. It was an act of defiance against the uncertainty that plagued her. Whatever the future held, tonight there would be soup. She hung the oil lamp from a central beam, and its warm, golden light pushed back the darkness, casting long, trembling shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The stable, which had once been just a temporary shelter, had begun to feel like something more, a home. The thought was so unexpected, so terrifying, that she almost dropped her knife. A soft knock at the door made her jump. She opened it to find Silas standing there, a dark shape against the star-dusted sky. He was holding her medical bag. "You left this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "At the church." He held it out to her, a practical excuse for a visit he clearly didn't know how to explain otherwise. She took the bag, her fingers brushing his. The familiar, small jolt passed between them. He didn't pull away this time. He just stood there, caught in the doorway, trapped between the cold, dark night behind him and the warm, lamp-lit room in front of him. The air was a rich tapestry of scents, the earthy aroma of the soup, the clean smell of the lingering rain on the night air, and the uniquely masculine scent of worn leather and horse that clung to him like a second skin. "I made soup," she said, the words a simple, unplanned invitation. He hesitated, then gave a slight nod and stepped inside, ducking his head under the low door frame. He seemed too large for the small, cozy space, a wild creature brought in from the plains. He looked around at her small cot, the neatly arranged medical supplies, the bubbling pot on the stove. He looked at the single lantern casting its intimate glow. He seemed to be seeing her, truly seeing the life she had carved out for herself here, for the very first time. They stood in an awkward silence, the simmering of the soup the only sound. Eliza knew she had to speak first. She had to clear the air, to set the terms before her own heart could betray her. "If I decide to stay," she said, her voice clear and firm, her gaze direct. "It won't be because of you." She saw him flinch, a barely perceptible tightening in his jaw. She pressed on, needing him to understand the whole truth. "It will be because I want to, because the work here matters, because this place feels like the road my heart was looking for." He listened, his expression unreadable. He processed her words, turning them over in his mind. He was not a man of easy sentiment. He was a man of practicalities, of hard truths. She had offered him one, and he returned it with one of his own. "I don't need someone to save me. Eliza," he said, his voice sure and steady. "And I'm not looking for a shadow to follow me around my own misery." He took a step closer, his pale eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What I need is a partner." The word hung in the air between them, imbued with a meaning that went far beyond business or ranching. A partner, an equal, someone to stand beside, not behind. It was the most honest, most vulnerable thing he had ever said. She ladled the soup into 2 tin bowls and set them on the small wooden table. They sat at opposite ends, the lantern between them, casting their faces in a dramatic dance of light and shadow. For a long time, they ate in silence, the simple, nourishing warmth of the food a comfort in itself. Then, slowly, hesitantly, they began to talk, not about the future, not about Santa Vespera or the ranch. They talked about the past. He asked about the engagement she had mentioned. She told him about Alistair Finch, a good man, a brilliant doctor, a man who had planned their entire lives out like a medical chart, leaving no room for spontaneity, for passion, for a calling that led to a dusty stable in the middle of nowhere. She, in turn, asked him about the ever-present sadness that clung to him, and he, in the warm, safe quiet of that room, finally spoke the name he had held locked in his heart for 2 years. Samuel, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. His name was Samuel, my younger brother. He was brighter than me, laughed more. He told her about the fire, about the fallen beam, about the knot. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, the words themselves scarred and broken. But she heard the whole story in the spaces between them. She heard the guilt, the suffocating weight of the one final knot he could not untie. She told him about her father, a blacksmith who had died from a simple infection, a cut that had festered because there was no doctor in their small town. That was why she had taken up nursing. That was why she had a soft spot for this valley's quiet, stoic blacksmith. The soup bowls emptied. The stories of the lost names, once spoken aloud, seemed to lose some of their terrible power. The distance between them, the length of the small table, began to shrink until it was no distance at all. The life he's offering me, Eliza said, her voice soft, thinking of the letter. It's a safe life. Everything is tied down, secure. She looked at him, her eyes mirroring a deep and honest fear. The truth is, Silas, I'm afraid of being tied down. Silas didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to a coil of rope hanging from a wooden peg on the wall, a tool of her trade and his. He looked at it for a long time, his expression thoughtful. A rope is a strange thing, he said, his voice a low murmur, as if he were thinking aloud. You can use it to tie something down, to trap it, to keep it from running. He paused, his pale eyes finding hers in the lantern light. But you can also use it to lead a horse to water. You can use it to pull a wagon from a ditch. You can use it to save a man from a fire. He held her gaze, and in that moment, she understood. He was reframing their shared symbol. A knot wasn't just a trap. A rope wasn't just a restraint. It was a connection, a tool for guidance, a means of salvation. The wind that had been whispering at the corners of the stable finally died down. The night grew still and quiet. The small flame of the oil lamp burned with a steady, unwavering light in the small, warm kitchen. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath, calm and at peace. Outside, the vast, dark pastures were soaked with the recent rains. The thirsty earth had drunk its fill, under the silent watch of 1,000,000 stars. The promise of a new season, of fresh, green grass, was quietly, patiently, waiting to be born. Sunday arrived on a soft, clean breeze, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The day felt truly blessed, a day of rest not just from labor, but from fear. The sound of children's laughter, a noise that had been scarce and muted for weeks, now tumbled freely through the air as they chased hoops down the main street, and from the small church at the end of the road. The bell rang out, its clear, resonant tone not a summons to a trial, but an invitation to peace. It was a sound that spoke of order restored, of a community finding its center again. Eliza was outside the stable, her medical bag open on the porch bench. She wasn't preparing to leave, but to stay. She was organizing, cleaning her instruments, refilling small glass bottles with tinctures and salves. It was the quiet, satisfying work of putting a house in order. The letter from Santa Vespera was gone, used the night before as kindling to start her small cooking fire. It had burned quickly, turning to a black, weightless ash before rising as smoke into the vast, dark sky. It was a choice made, a bridge burned, a new road chosen. She was so absorbed in her task, polishing a small mirror she used for looking into throats, that she didn't hear him approach. It was the sudden stillness of the air, the casting of a long shadow, that made her look up. Silas was there, sitting atop Mercury, the great gray stallion as still as a statue. He wasn't on the road. He had stopped directly in front of her porch, a quiet and deliberate arrival. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his face unreadable in the morning light. He swung down from the saddle, his movements as fluid and economical as always. He led Mercury to the hitching post, but he didn't tie the reins. He just let them rest, a gesture of trust, a sign that this was not a brief stop. Then he walked to the steps of her porch and stood before her. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. A group of children stopped their game, watching with wide, curious eyes. A woman on her way to church paused, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. This was a private moment happening in a very public space, and everyone knew it. The fate of the solitary rancher and the traveling nurse was a story they had all become a part of. He looked at her, at the neat rows of bottles, at the focused, capable set of her hands. He looked at the peaceful expression on her face, the question that had been lodged in his throat for days, a knot of hope and terror, was too large, too momentous to be spoken aloud. To ask, "Will you stay?" would be to risk a no that he wasn't sure he could bear to hear, so he didn't ask with words. He reached up, and with a slow, almost ceremonial gravity, he took off his hat. It was the gesture that had come to define him in her eyes, a ritual of stripping away his defenses. At the bridge, he had set it aside for a task. In the storm, he had set it down to face a crisis. At the church, he had placed it on the altar as a vow of defiance. Now, he held it in his hands for a long moment, then turned and placed it gently on the porch railing beside her medical bag. It was not the act of a man preparing for a fight or a job. It was the act of a man coming home, laying down his final piece of armor, a quiet and complete surrender. His face was bare, his pale eyes vulnerable, his entire being exposed in the clear morning sun. He didn't need to speak. His actions had asked the question. Now, he gave her his answer, his reasons, his plea. He slowly extended his right hand, not to touch her, but simply opening it, palm up, in the space between them. It was just a hand, but in the morning light, Eliza saw it was a map of his entire world. She saw the thick, ingrained calluses on his palm and at the base of his fingers, a testament to a life of hard, unrelenting labor, of gripping reins, of mending fences, of heaving hay. It was a life of struggle and resilience. And there, running like a faint silver river across the landscape of his hardened skin, was the scar from the stitches she had given him on the night of the storm. It was a mark of their shared past, a sign of her healing touch on his life of pain. His open hand was an offering. It held all of his hardship, all of his solitude, all of his stubborn pride, and the small, fragile mark of the connection they had forged in the heart of chaos. It was everything he was, and everything he had to give. She looked from his hand to his face, at the raw hope in his eyes. Her own heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm, a drumbeat of certainty. She didn't need words either. Her answer was not for the town to hear, but for him to feel. She rose from the bench and took a single step forward, closing the small, safe distance between them. She reached out, but not for his offered hand. Her fingers, cool and gentle, came up to cup his jaw, a touch that was both intimate and infinitely comforting. He stood perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. She leaned in, and slowly, with a tenderness that spoke of a deep and certain knowledge, she pressed her lips to the faint, puckered scar on his cheek, the one left by the splintered board in the storm. It was not a kiss of passion, but of acceptance, a kiss of healing, a light, warm pressure that said, "I see your wounds, I see your past, and I am not afraid." It was a silent vow, a quiet answer that resonated more profoundly than any shouted yes. He closed his eyes, a shudder passing through his powerful frame. It was the feeling of a great weight, one he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there, finally being lifted. A sudden gust of wind, a playful remnant of the storm, rustled through the cottonwood trees. It caught the new flag that the mayor had hung on the town hall, making the small knots in the rope that held it tap gently against the pole, a sound like a quiet, satisfied applause. Far down the eastern road, a lone rider crested a hill and disappeared over the horizon. No one in Barlow Flats saw him go, but the oppressive weight of his presence had already lifted from the valley. Barrett Mercer was gone. The power he had wielded, as swift and destructive as a flash flood, had been diverted. Its course changed, sinking back into the earth and leaving the land to heal. Later that day, Silas was back at the stable, but he wasn't there to visit. He was there to work. With a hammer and nails, he took down Eliza's simple, hand-painted plank. In its place, he hung a new sign, one he had commissioned from the town's woodcutter. It was made of sturdy, polished oak, the letters carved deep and clear. It read, Barlow Flats, Clinic Library, and beneath, in smaller letters, a simple, eloquent promise open when the light is on. Eliza came out, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw him stepping back to admire his work. The sign was a partnership, a fusion of her world and his. It was a gift not just to her, but to the town, a place for healing bodies and nurturing minds. It was the foundation of a shared future. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes and made them shine. "Undo me, slowly," she said softly, the words no longer an instruction for a knot, but a gentle plea for the careful, patient untangling of a human heart. A little each day. He turned to her, the ghost of a smile playing on his own lips. He looked at the new sign, at her, at the quiet promise of the life stretching out before them. He had spent years tying himself in knots of grief and isolation. Now, he finally had a reason to learn how to untie them. "And me as well," he answered, his voice full of a quiet, certain peace. They stood together on the porch, two solitary figures no longer alone. They didn't touch, but they stood shoulder to shoulder, a comfortable and solid presence beside each other. They looked out past the town to the vast, open rangeland, where the pastures, saturated by the recent rains, were already showing the first tender, brilliant green shoots of new growth. The hope for their future didn't shout or clamor for attention. It was quiet, steady, and enduring, like the turning of the seasons, as reliable as the gait of a good horse on a long road home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.